Well, folks, welcome back to another episode of What's Next. And my next guest has got some incredible experiences from around the world, not to mention 2 decades in the space of sports athlete management. And I'd also say marketing, equally vetted. We're going to talk about that. In addition to raising over $40 million in endorsement deals for his clients. And this idea that for his clients, it's really about scouting them, mentoring them, and helping them achieve. And that's probably what we're going to spend the entire show on, which could be a couple hours worth. But without any further ado, Cisco Terreros, welcome to the show from Felkrem. So glad to have you.
Thank you, Coach Bryan Finnerty, man. It's been a pleasure to build a relationship with you throughout the years and hopefully bringing all that knowledge that you've downloaded into my brain and now to all of your listeners and viewers. So thank you for having me. This is a great tool for a lot of people.
And I think it does fall kind of right in that mid spot of this mentorship idea, which was the whole kickoff of speaking to athletes and high achievers who are thinking about this world of going it on their own and entrepreneurship. And holy crap, what should I look out for? And, maybe what you can help me kind of steer in the right direction of. So that's what we're going to cover. As you think back on the starting of your career, so before we think about your athletes, your firm, were you always an entrepreneur? I think people ask that. Was it something that you had in you? Did you do it long enough, not as an entrepreneur, to then say, I'm just going for it? Like, what was that journey like for you?
Yeah, I think in hindsight now, understanding who I am as a 40-year-old and maturity, maybe a little bit later than most folks, I think that being diagnosed with ADHD is something that came very late in my life. Literally, I was just diagnosed 2.5 years ago. There's that pretty common ideology that most people with ADHD tend to be serial entrepreneurs because they have that passion and these ideas. But most importantly, that they have that willingness and that superpower to have enough energy to go after them. And so, yeah, to answer your question, I've always been an entrepreneur. When I was 11, and I often tell the story to my kids and they kind of make fun of me a little bit. But when I was 11, that's when kissing started becoming really cool amongst my peers. And it was the hot topic in the lunchroom or at recess. So when I thought, hey, everybody's worried about their breath because obviously they're trying to kiss their little girlfriends or boyfriends. And so I'd go to Costco, the equivalent of Costco in Colombia, where I was born and raised, and I would buy packs of gum and then I would individualize them. And I would put them in a fanny pack and then I would sell them individually. And that was my first little business. And I made some good money. I can't tell you how much it was, but I definitely had cool shoes and cool necklaces thanks to this. Fast forward when my family and I had immigrated to the US, escaping the drug war that we were experiencing in Colombia. When I started playing college soccer, as you know, collegiate athletes are not supposed to have a job, especially when in my circumstance, I was not an American citizen then. And so I had always cut my own hair. Why? I have no idea. I think it was out of resource. And so I thought, well, maybe let me try to cut some hair. And I was charging $5 a head. And every play, because when you start at college, when you're playing a sport, you start at the dorms. And so I was cutting all the football teams' heads, all of the baseball team, basketball team. So I got to know a lot of cool people. I got to cut their hair, and I was charging $5 a head. So yeah, I mean, there's so many stories like that sprinkled throughout my life, and I've expressed this entrepreneurship spirit, and it's played to my benefit.
Man, Patrick Dees was, I think, episode 1 or 2 with us, and he tells a very similar story of gathering candy. I worked at a little mini mart grocery store as a kid. I would buy Now and Laters. Those were my candy, pack them in the backpack, go to school and sell them. It feels like it's this universal kid side hustle that you buy at one rate, you sort of learn the cost of goods sold and off you go. So how old were you when you came from Colombia to the US?
I was 17 years old. And as you can imagine, and as anybody who's been exposed to or is old enough to have been exposed to what was happening in Colombia then in the 90s and 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, we came escaping drug war. And we came to the state of Utah, where I currently live. Although I've lived all throughout the US, we found our way back here. And it was a pretty tough experience. Looking back, I never thought I was trauma or traumatic experience, but now looking back, obviously it was. You uproot a 17-year-old who's building his life, college, high school friends, high school environment. It was my senior year of high school in Colombia. And you just completely unplug that person from there and then plug it here in the state of Utah, a state that was not as diverse as it is now, which played to my advantage. It allowed me to be a little bit more Americanized than I would have been if I would have moved to a place like California or even Florida. It was pretty difficult. I'm not going to lie. We moved here with, as you can imagine, like any immigrant story. My parents, my dad had a PhD in econ. He had a JD. He was a lawyer and completely leaves everything and comes here. And he's working at a PetSmart at night, cleaning it. And then during the day, he worked an assembly line for a company called Coremark, which is the company that supplies stores like 7-Eleven. Again, to me, that was always such, when I look back and I think of my father, who I admire and love so much, and you and I have talked about this a lot, is such an example of somebody who's gone through education galore, has had some incredible jobs, was the secretary of the ambassador of the United States in Colombia. And here he is cleaning pet stores at night. So as you can imagine, pretty difficult story. Migrate here. We had $400, 4 suitcases. We moved in with a family of four in a 700 square foot apartment, 2 bedroom apartment. They lived in one bedroom. We lived in the other bedroom. My parents obviously slept in the bed. My little sister slept on one side of the bed on the floor, and I slept on the other side on the floor. And I don't tell this story to encourage people to feel pity for me, but rather to say, if I can do it, if I can accomplish anything as big or as small as you may imagine it, I think anybody can. And that's the reason why I just love the United States of America, because it allows people to have second opportunities like I've had.
Man, there's so much published, written, sourced about this immigrant mentality, which in your guys' case, obviously there is no plan B, right? To burn the boats at the shore. I think most of us that grow up in the US, self included, I could say lower middle class, but the reality was I was always encouraged to build a plan B because there was one. In your case, where there is no plan B, we're going to the States, we're getting out of this drug cartel war zone and heading to a new life with, to your point, an old teenager, which is a tough time to be uprooted. You kind of don't have any other choice but to go for it, right? And I think part of that is you get instilled with some, hey, go for it because you have to make it. And then the other is, are you jaded with that? Or do you sort of take this empathetic look at, hey, I can understand how hard that is too, right? So did you have that wrestling match of sort of being pissed about it and had to, or I heard a little bit there that, no, man, I wasn't thinking it was good for me at the time, but maybe it was. Like, how did that fall for you?
Yeah, I think it was a good mixture of both for a little bit. One of the beautiful things of having ADHD is that we tend to forget things pretty quickly. And by the way, we forget simple things and also major things pretty quickly. But obviously, I was fairly annoyed at the situation. Imagine you being 17 and being uprooted from where you lived and your experiences that you were having, that you were excited to have. So at first, I was pretty devastated. We get here, and I remember vividly, our flight went from Medellin, where I'm from, to Miami. And when we landed in Miami, immigration agent said, I said, hello. And he says, and he corrected how I said hello, because obviously I didn't speak any English. And he said he was Cuban. And he said, if you want to live here and if you want to stay here, you got to learn how to speak it, speak the language. And I thought it was really impactful. And I think that moment, my whole concept changed. From there, there was a snow delay and we got redirected to St. Louis. And that was the first time I'd seen snow. It was actually the night of the Super Bowl when St. Louis was at the Super Bowl, the iconic, I think it was 2000, 2001. And, again, that's the first time I've seen snow. So all of these new experiences that were happening so quickly just changed my mindset. And from that point on, I never looked back. I've always been very excited to have migrated. I think it was the biggest blessing of my life. Now looking back, obviously, I have to unpack a lot of that trauma and everything that was negative that I kind of put a lid on because I had to. I had no other choice, like you said. But there is that empathy that comes with it, right? Because you understand what it feels like to be a minority. You understand what it feels like to be different. And with that comes the injection of we ought to respect everyone and we ought to love everyone as equals. And I think that's been the common denominator and the most important thing that I've gathered from this experience was that coming to a place where I don't look like everybody else. So yeah, it was that wrestling match of am I excited about this or not? But then again, there was one point in my life that I just never looked back and I still haven't.
Okay, so I'm getting a very clear picture, and you and I have known each other for almost a decade, but getting a much clearer picture of the formation of Felkrem and why you do what you do that is different than I think most sports agents and certainly most sports agencies. Before we talk about that, why go into this world of sports agency? Was that one of your first jobs and you grew up in the industry? Did you spend a few years there and want to come over? What was it that drew you to that and ultimately led you to starting your own firm?
Yeah, growing up, soccer, football, whatever you want to call it, the world's language was part of me, has always been part of me. It's been a passion, has been an addiction, has been the way of life. And in a place like Colombia, it really is way of life, from clothing to music to everything. And that's, I think that's one of the most beautiful things about our countries. We're really happy people. We're really loving people, but we love soccer and it means a lot to us. The reason being, and I think this is, and I don't want to digress, but I think this adds to the story in the 90s when we were going through this awful financial and security time of our country through the drug war and the civil war, if you will. Soccer was the only thing that we could hang our hat on. P. Valderrama, Tino Asprilla, some of these giant legends in the game. This is when they were coming up. This is when Colombia was ranked number one in the world. This is when Colombia was scheduled and favorite to win the 94 World Cup. This is when Colombia was it, and it was our only outlet. And so for that reason, it was always ingrained in me. Again, remember how I told you the ADHDers, a lot of times we don't remember. I can recall the minute that Frederic Cohn scored that tying goal against Germany in the 90 World Cup. I was 7 years old. And so again, it was always ingrained in me. So I always knew I wanted to stay within that. I always knew that I wanted to live my passion. I had a dream of being an artist. I had a dream of being a dentist. I wanted to be a lawyer like my father, but I always knew that I was going to end up in soccer somehow. And that's what happened. When we first migrated to Utah, a few years later, when I was in college, the Olympics came here, the 2002 Olympics. And that was my first job in sports. That's where I put my foot in the door and said, okay, what does this really look like? And then from then on, it's just snowballed. So yeah, it's something that I always knew I wanted to be in and do. And it's created that evolution of who I am today.
So you've got the bug, you get to work at the Olympics, got to be an unbelievable experience on, again, global stage, which exposes you to all of that. At what point do you go from, okay, I'm working for somebody else to, I think I'm going to go do this on my own? Because that's one of the most popular questions we get from our audience is like, when do you know? I mean, it's almost asking, when do you know you've met the love of your life, right? The answer typically is like, I don't know, you just know. But when was it for you that you said, I'm going to stop working for somebody else and I'm going to go do my own thing?
I think there's two school of thoughts of how people get to that entrepreneur bug. This is, I have to do something. One is the person who is working in a full-time job and they're sure entrepreneurs like myself, and they always have that thought, this would be a good idea. That would be a good idea. And then there's the other people like your mom who ended up becoming entrepreneurs because they somewhat had to, right? Which, by the way, one of my favorite episodes of the show is your mom's episode. But I think I always was part of that first school of thought of I always knew I wanted to do something. I just didn't know what it was. When I was at Real Salt Lake, which was my first official job in soccer, I started a nonprofit. And through the nonprofit, I started a clothing line that then funded the nonprofit. So again, that entrepreneurship was always there. However, when I was at the crew and I was working for Brian Bliss, and I was working with Brian Bliss, I should say, who was the general manager at Blissy, who I absolutely adore and look up to and has been a father figure to me for so many years. I remember back then scouting was not going into Y Scout or some of these giant scouting platforms and watch a game. Back then, agents would email you DVDs and then you would pop in the
Now
DVD
you're
and you
dating
choose and
yourself,
you would
man.
watch the games. I know, not crazy. The craziest part, and this is a true story, Blissy would give me these stacks of DVDs and he said, watch this, let me know what you find. Players from all over the world, anywhere you can imagine. And then I started noticing something really interesting. Some of the DVDs would be a tiny bit faster, not enough to notice with the naked eye, but when you watch so many or when you watch a full game, you would then start noticing some discrepancies. So I brought it up to Bliss and I said, hey, is something wrong with my computer? It was like, well, a lot of agents will speed up the DVD a little bit so you think the player's a little bit faster. Again, this is a general assumption. Don't know if that's true or not. I don't think an agent has ever raised their hand and says, yes, we did.
Of course
But
not.
then I started asking and questioning that part of of our industry a lot, and that integrity and that honesty and that transparency. And so I then started talking to Blissy a lot. And not only was he entrusting me and helping me grow within the scouting side of the game, but he also took me under his wing and I was his assistant coach for the U20 Columbus crew team. We won 4 national championships in 5 years. Obviously, Owen and you have been very exposed to the crew and the youth system. And we were literally the pioneers of that. Blissy was. I was just tagging along. And during all these rides, as we would drive throughout Ohio, Illinois, Pennsylvania, we'd sit in the car and I would just ask him questions. And the more we talked, the more I realized there's a space here for somebody like myself, who is an immigrant, who looks a little bit different, who has 2 languages, but is so Americanized that can kind of bridge that gap and create a new value proposition as an agent. And I told him, what do you think? And he said, just jump. And so I left the crew and I started working with an agency. And that's when things just took off. Not took off this way, by the way, but they took off.
So let's keep going there. If you make the jump, and I think if we only watch any channel on social media, if we see all the sexy pictures of what it looks like to be an entrepreneur and the Lamborghinis in the mansion, and the minute you jump, your bank account gets nice and fat, you and I and probably 99% of all entrepreneurs know that's not always the case. So you jump and you said it didn't go up and to the right. What was it like? I mean, what was that jump off in the next X amount of months or even years like for you as you're trying to find that way?
I was really excited, obviously, because I knew that I needed the knowledge and the experience. I knew I needed a tailored and controlled environment, and working for an agency was that to be able to gain that experience. Was it Mike Tyson that said, you have a plan until you get punched in the face or something along those lines? And that's exactly what happened. Life does continue as you're trying to build your life through your professional life, I should say. And one of the things that happened was that I experienced a divorce. And to anybody that has experienced such thing, it's an awful experience. So we lived in Chicago at the time the divorce happened. We had two children, two boys, and my ex-wife decides to move back to Utah where we had met. And so I was left in Chicago. And I think that's where I really, truly experienced for the first time everything that the trauma that we've spoken about of migrating and uprooting a 17-year-old. That's when all those things started really collapsing for me, and then the honest depression hits in. And so that unfortunately had me take a huge step back. I only lasted at the agency 9 months. It was an incredible difficult time. I remember vividly, this was months after the divorce. It was a September, and I spent in my little tiny apartment in Chicago less than 24 hours. That's the only time I had been at quote unquote home because this job was so demanding. And you add on top of that the layer of the divorce, not seeing your kids every day anymore because they now live in a different state. And that's when I just made my decision and said, what are my priorities here? I need to do something different. And I left. I moved back to Utah and with no plan, absolutely no plan, just hoping and praying that somehow someone or something would catch me. And thank goodness somebody did. And that's when, shortly after is I met literally the love of my life and the person I've been married to now for 10 years. And we've known each other for 12. And we've now built a beautiful life. It's not your cookie cutter type life, right? Obviously, I think marriage, like entrepreneurship, is messy. There's a lot of mistakes that are made, but there's a lot of victories too. And I think that's the reason why we just feel so close and so in love to the point that she's literally now my business partner. But to go back to the professional landscape, I take this giant step back, move to Utah, and then I start obviously where everything began. I go back to the Olympic Committee. I go back to the sports environment here, and I try to, try to work at Real Salt Lake again, try to do something, and nothing was panning out. Obviously, it's now my timeline, not theirs. And so I'm trying to force my timeline into theirs. And obviously, sometimes that's not doable. And one of the things that I started doing is obviously I needed an income. And so I started working at Wells Fargo. That was my first job. It was a teller. And so I thought, well, I mean, I have the network there. I could go back to the banking. And so that's what I did. And when I was there, I then started applying for jobs within Wells Fargo, anything related to sports. And somehow they trusted me and sent me to San Francisco, where I managed all of the region sports assets like Stanford, 49ers, Warriors. And that's when my career, not wanting to, took a completely different route of player management to now going into marketing. And Bryan, looking back, obviously you think, wow, this was a giant step back. But now today, at the age of 40, and as a FIFA licensed agent and managing Felkrem, I can now say that I have somewhat of a 360 approach into player management because not only do I have the knowledge and experience and network on the soccer side, but now I have it also on the marketing side and how these giant brands think when they're about to sign an athlete. And so that's when really that picture starts then forming by force, by fire. And yeah, things just continued to evolve from that point. But when I look back at that time, it was obviously a very dark time, Bryan. I obviously, you know this from talking, and it's one that I look back and think, do I wish that it wouldn't have happened? Obviously, but then at the same time, I'm glad it happened because I'm here today.
Yeah. First and foremost, thanks for the transparency because we talk a lot on the show and you and I talk about this. I feel like I'm the same person on Tuesday as I am on Saturday. I love this transparency. I think that's how we get quickest to the truth and your ability to be raw about that. That's what life is about. And what I wrote down coming out of that is you looked for a chance to get some experience, which in this transition did not mean you started your own shop. You went to work for a firm in Chicago. Life happened really hard. And even in coming back with, in theory, no game plan from the outside view, I'd say, you know, what you did is you followed your passion. You didn't go get some job just because you followed your passion. And it was, hey, I'm going to go into banking, but I want to be connected to sport. And oddly enough, it tends to work that way that you got connected, which then, as you pointed out, gave you a pretty darn good 360 view of not just what does an athlete need out of endorsement deal, but maybe more importantly, no disregard to the athletes, but what does the company that's writing that check need from that experience? And I think that is what sets you apart and probably a really good transition to, let's talk about Felkrem, because I do believe, having played pro soccer for 11 years, having had an agent who is still one of my best friends, who will clearly tell you he was just a lawyer negotiating a contract. There was no mentorship. There was sometimes some friendship, but it wasn't about what was next. It was, let's get a deal done. And I think what you've created at Felkrem certainly kind of broadens the scope. You use 360 kind of view of that. So talk about the company as a whole. What sets you guys apart? I think it's simple to say you represent athletes, but it is so much more. So someone corners you in an elevator. What do you say about Felkrem?
I would say my pitch is we have a different approach to player representation that is somewhat similar to everyone, but a little bit deeper. Can we understand the value of an athlete on and off the field? And then can we try to extract that value as genuine and as transparent and as organic as possible? And again, the value proposition of me as an agent is that my road here has not been your typical, the most agents take. And one could argue that, yeah, this is a guy that might have made a lot of mistakes and had a lot of successes, but I actually view it as all successes because those mistakes, learning from them and being able to evolve from them, and a lot of the times I'm still evolving from a lot of those mistakes, have made me the agent that I am today. And that is that transparency and that authenticity is what we want to bring to this space, to this industry, because that's what we need here. We need athletes who are authentic. We need people who 4 or 5 year old can look up to and say, this is who I'd want to become like. And that's what we're passionate about. Felkrem was born out of necessity, if you will, just like, again, as we talked about before, but it was a controlled environment necessity. And it hasn't been easy at all. In fact, it's been the complete opposite. There's a lot of entrepreneurs that fortunately have cash injections or funds or investments or support or even an education. I and my wife didn't have any of that. And we've started Felkrem and we've managed and we've grown Felkrem with nothing, with no financial foundation, with no true education, just the education from the streets. And I think that's the reason why the company means so much more to us and has become part of who we are. And that's the reason why we just love what we do.
So, in hearing that, the word that comes out for me is culture, right? I'm bringing that up because even if you're a starting entrepreneur, I think it's, well, if my company's less than this size, 10 people, 5 people, whatever, we don't really need to talk about culture. It'll be something when we grow the company. You and I have known each other for a long time. And I do believe that our experiences in our previous lives and along the way do shape the culture that we have, all the way down to you mentioning that your wife, LC, is your business partner. And again, if you look at mainstream society, what would they tell you? Don't ever get in business with a spouse, your family, or your best friends. And yet here you guys are doing this thing, building a company that is on that foundation of transparency, looking out for the athlete. I think those are things that are easy to say in our industry. Oh, we're always looking out for the athlete. But in reality, it's about the athlete that gets so-and-so the best revenue, right? So as you guys think about culture, starting with yourselves, what is it that you are building into the company that then oozes out of the company so that any athletes on the outside are like, I want some of that versus some of something else?
This is the part of my personal story where if this were a movie, although I don't ever doubt anybody would make or watch a movie about me, this is the part of the movie where this broken guy gets rescued by this amazing girl and they fall in love. And again, as I explain and as vulnerably tell your audience the story of my divorce, that's where Elsie Lauren, her name, she goes by Elsie, she always has, but that's just where she comes in. She literally rescues this broken person who's doesn't have a true identity. I never knew if I was Hispanic, if I was American, because I was so Americanized. I didn't know where I belonged. And she's been so loving and patient throughout it all, throughout the mistakes I've made, the successes I've had, the ups and downs. And like you said, most people would tell you don't get in business with your spouse, family, or best friend. And she's all three of those. And here we are succeeding. Today, I don't value success by a dollar amount or an amount of clients or revenues, but rather, am I happy? And Brian, I can't express how happy I feel today. And that happiness has not come because of subsequent happinesses that have happened in the past. It's happened because I've been able to look at the pain and the mistakes and the downs in the face and say, what can I learn from this and be authentic? And that is the culture we've tried to build at our company, from our team members to our clients, is can we be authentic? And I tell you this story about my wife because this is literally coming from her. I think one of the best decisions I've made is understanding and giving up the reins of everything to an unbelievable person like her. And again, that is one of the things that she's installed from the moment we started Felkrem until today: authenticity. And that's our culture. And that's what we want to be. We want to be as authentic as possible because we are different. We're very different, as I expressed throughout this episode, is very unique from my background to even the way I speak and the way I think. And that's what we want to present to people is that we're authentic and we're different.
So in saying that, yeah, I love that, right? Because I think it's bold, it's strong. I love the commitment that you and Elsie have to making this happen. Denise and I were blessed to run a couple of companies together and still married 33 years later, which is great. And also realize that there are some businesses that we do invest in that don't require both of our strengths, which is, it's great to know both. And as you guys look across the landscape, who isn't your client? Because I think it's easy to say, I know this isn't true, but we'll take anybody, right? I mean, if they're a world-class soccer star, you'll sign them. They're a client. I know that not to be true about you, but I want to hear from you. Who isn't your client, right? When they come to you and they're selling you too, right? I want you to take me as your new client, or their parents might be doing that. Who doesn't fit for you guys?
We've gotten here by trial and error because when you're starting an agency, you have to take on anyone. Revenue is the number one goal, and you are genuine and willing to give this athlete your everything because they also want to give their everything. They also want to get to a specific place. And it is not about talent. I think talented athletes are everywhere, but it's deeper than that. And that's what kind of player we are always looking for. And we always look for one common denominator. Are they humble? And I know that sounds cliche. I know that sounds silly at times, but it is the reality. The more I've worked in this industry, having been with two professional teams, have been really close to the athletes, and then now obviously working on this side of the space, I've realized the athletes who are humble are more willing to work harder. They're more willing to accept the challenges that come with professionalism. You might be the superstar in your town, in your region. You might have been the superstar of your last team, but this team doesn't need you to be a superstar and you need to suck up the bench until they call your name. And that requires a lot of humility. There's challenges also outside of the environment because we are in professional sports, and unfortunately our industry is very tied to your emotional and who you are emotionally, and it rides that wave. If you're on the up as a soccer player, your emotional believe in yourself is high, but if you're not, then it's low. But humility is that common denominator that keeps people leveled. And so again, I know it may sound cliche, but that is what we're looking for. Is this player humble? In every pitch we're on, that's what we're doing. Like you said, obviously we're trying to sell Felkrem to this parents and to this athlete. But the reality is we're also trying to take in as much information as we can. Because obviously we do the extensive scouting, but then also we're looking for that humility in an athlete. And one of the most interesting things about how you and I became close was obviously thanks to Owen and the amazing athlete that he's become. And here you are, a father and a wife raising two boys who are phenomenal and have everything that they could imagine. And yet you've installed in them that humility. And that was one of the things that I just said, this family is completely different than any other family who may be in your circumstance, financially, emotionally, etc. And that's the type of player. And by the way, then when we were talking about helping Owen go from a 15, 16-year-old boy to a professional athlete, maybe that was not as clear to me as that's the type of athlete I want, but that was definitely a good foundation for me to say this type of athlete exists in every economical category. It doesn't matter if you're incredibly wealthy or coming from a humble background. There can be humility in an athlete. And you look at O today and who he is as an athlete. And despite of whatever happens, if he plays 10 World Cups or if he plays zero, he will always be an outstanding person because of that core of humility.
I appreciate that. And I do agree with you. It can be commonplace to use that word, but when you really drill down to all the good context you put behind humility, there are a few common threads that I find with entrepreneurs who are truly successful. And we're not talking about bank accounts. To me, success is freedom. Do I have freedom of time? Do I have freedom over my money? Do I have freedom of the relationships of the people that I'm with? And do I have the freedom to make choice? And in those freedoms and the successes I've seen in entrepreneurs, there is a common thread of humility, 100%. To stay on that thread, do you think if when you're looking at young athletes, let's say they come to you, they're cocky, they're full of it. Talent is table stakes. You got to have talent. So the scouting, yeah, okay, you're good enough. But on the humility side, do you think humility can be taught, trained, learned?
Yes, and I think I'm a perfect example of that. right? We talk about my career, this gap in my life after the divorce. And then as we continue to build Felkrem, I lost that sense of humility. And this is something really difficult for me to admit. And then I started thinking, well, I've always known I could be really good at this, but now the proof is in the pudding. We are succeeding. And you kind of lose a little bit of that humility that's been ingrained in me because of my experiences. And again, Mike Tyson, you have a plan until you get punched in the face. And then I get punched in the face and I'm forced to remember and relearn everything about humility again. And so, yeah, it can definitely be taught. And the worst part about being taught humility is that a lot of the times it does not come in a book, or it does not come in a way of a happy emotional experience. It's usually a difficult one. Again, punches you in the face. And I think that's the beauty of it. But that is, once again, the value proposition that we have. Like many people in our industry, tied my self-worth to the outward worth and what people thought of me. Social media was everything to me. Everything on that aspect of that self-worth being tied to what people thought and what people saw of me. And when that starts collapsing, then so does your self-worth. And being able to be connected back to humility and connected back to authenticity has allowed me to relearn it, regrow it, and it's still a work in process. I think humility is something that you have to work on every single day because it's not easy, especially in our industry. Because again, I take one of our clients to West Ham, as I happened a couple of months ago, and here I am at the top of the pyramid once again. But being able to connect back to that authenticity and say, am I doing this because I know my self worth? Am I doing this because I hope that other people see my self worth? And that has been the biggest difference in me, at least, on being able to exercise and remember that humility that I continue to learn every day.
Man, this could be a whole nother show, but I'll say in my world, that's called imposter syndrome, right? Which is it what I hope somebody else sees? You just said it. Or is it actually what I believe in myself? And I'm 57. I think outwardly you'd say grown businesses, sold businesses, had a chance to play pro sports. Resume looks great. Yet I fought up until probably 4 or 5 years ago, really fought my entire life believing I wasn't good enough until I did what you just said, which is seek sort of the inward opinion, if you will, right? That humility of just look in the mirror, forget what other people are going to say or want to see or want to do. It actually doesn't matter and you'll chase it forever. But when you look in the mirror, you'll know if you worked hard enough. Did you study hard enough? Did you love enough? All those things that you can add. It was such a relief for me. So I love to hear the way you said that, which is not seeking that outward approval. Because I think as again, our audience thinks about making this journey or is making the journey into entrepreneurship. I don't care how successful you might have been on an NFL field or on a tennis court at the US Open. When you step into this world, it's just a little bit different. And this humility, if you will, does come at a cost. It's our life experiences. So I appreciate you sharing that part of the journey. I'm going to fast forward to the very last part here, which I think leads into this, which is your mantra of scout, mentor, achieve. So for your athletes to achieve whatever their dreams might be, you've mentioned kind of how you find them, the filters, the humility seek, if you will, which is great. And then the achieve part feels to me totally radically different than most firms, which would be when you're not of an asset to me, check you later. Right. So I know you and I have spent some time talking about what you do with and for your athletes, not from a full menu perspective, but maybe a couple of things that you do with them off of the field to set them up for success that achieve maybe during or after they're done.
Go back to that culture and that one word, authenticity. One of the things that I always wanted to do, because I've actually been really passionate about, is mentoring. If it's through a church group or if it's, coaching the Columbus Crew Youth or Real Salt Lake Youth or whatever is experiences I've had as a coach, that's always been a passion. And in reality, am I the right person to mentor others? Maybe not, right? Especially because although I'm 40 years old, I feel like I peaked and matured very late in my life. And so, am I on paper the best mentor that can be? Definitely not, maybe. But it goes deeper than that. And I think that's where that humility can come from on both ways. Listen, as an athlete, when I'm sitting with the parents, I may know a lot of people. I may be able to be different. I may be able to offer some different assets or some different things to you and your child. But the reality is, I think the biggest strength that I have is I'm not going to hear and tell you, well, I have a perfect recipe to help him or her become messy, but rather I am willing to go through the hard work and identify what I don't know that you're asking so we together can find a solution and answer and get to that point. And I think that's where that mentorship thing can come in because it's not just me, this all in all, know it all type of person saying, I have every solution to your problems. Ryan, I don't. That's the simple reality. But I think that authenticity can allow me to be willing to be flexible enough to then try to navigate through that. And then when it comes to the achieve part, every athlete has a different goal. Every athlete has a different dream. And one of my favorite clients, Kate Delfava, who plays here locally at the Utah Royals, before she was drafted, she actually hadn't been accepted to medical school. And here is an incredibly young woman having a career path already established in professional soccer comes, and she's now one of the captains of the Utah Royals. I tell this story to say we want to be as authentic and as flexible as possible in hopes of helping our athletes grow in whatever it is way that they want to and achieve. Again, to some people may mean a World Cup, to others may mean to start a foundation like Kate just did. But again, being able and being willing to be that flexible is what really sets us apart. And that's that achieve component of our ethos as a company.
What I love, and I'm a note taker guy, as you well know, I'm writing down the part about the authenticity, and there's some depth to that. And then my second word that went with what you said was transparent. And I'd say for anybody running a business, honestly, if you're even working in a business as a high performer, the humility comes with your ability to say, I don't know sometimes. And quite frankly, even if you do, and this goes to your achieve part, let's go on that journey together. Because in that, you're mentoring, you're teaching, you're showing vulnerability, and you're discovering. And I think as you do that in front of a young athlete who, for the most part, all their lives, and we can think about them, some of them we can see in ourselves, we know it all. We're the best goalkeeper on the field. We're the best at whatever. But someone basically saying, hey, let's go on this journey of discovery together. That to me is one of the most foundational tools you could ever give an athlete post a professional career. Because then whether they're starting a business, going to sell insurance, working at a car dealership, or going on to be a doctor, understanding that you're going to be on a journey to go discover is a pretty enlightening thing. And I think success and humility get tied together with that. So that's awesome, right? What a gift that you can give your athletes.
And again, as we just talked about, humility and transparency is something that, I mean, yeah, it's definitely talked about in books and podcasts, and you could take courses on it. But for you to really make it an ingrained part of who you are, you have to be able to go through difficult, embarrassing, vulnerable times. And that's what I've experienced as recent as a couple of months ago, right? And then again, is that evolution of experiences and what we do with them that can make or break somebody. And I just choose to not let it break me, but rather help me build upon it. And my wife and I just had a pretty neat experience meeting with a young teenage and her parents playing the national team already, a phenomenal athlete. And reality is, Bryan, although she's 15, 16, I'm also being mentored by her. I'm also learning a lot about life from a young athlete who has got this big dream, who is humble, who is willing to do the work. And so the mentorship is not just one way. And I think that's one of the things that really allows us to continue to grow is can we absorb as much knowledge on the opposite end as well? And that's been the one of the most favorite parts about my job is being willing to see the value that other humans who you are working for have and what value they can inject into your life as well. And again, it goes back to that authenticity.
Well, you just summed up the perfect part of why start a podcast, which is sure, asking questions, I think is part of it. That's how we get to the meat of stuff. But I get to listen, right, to guys like yourself speak about life experiences in some parts so that I don't maybe repeat them and others that I can take in what that journey is like and start to shape maybe a straighter path to what my version of success is, which you and I both talked about, but I appreciate you sharing that. Before we wrap, I always like to know, you go back and talk to your, let's say, 22-year-old, 25-year-old self. What is I don't firmly believe in life hacks, but let's say you could save yourself a little bit of pain, get there a little bit faster. What's the one piece of advice that you might give to your younger self to either do, not do, avoid, chase after, whatever it is?
Don't boycott the pain. Don't boycott the hardships that come with growth. Our 6-year-old experiences a lot of leg pains. He's taller and bigger than most kids. And I think he's going to be a pretty remarkable athlete because he's just so hyper focused in sports. And one of the complaints that he often has is, "Oh, my legs hurt," and we've now discovered that it's part of growing pains, right? And is that physically and medically real or not? I'm sure that there's not. He's not been diagnosed as such, is what I'm trying to say. But when I look at that and I look at the life of somebody like myself, yourself, or anybody that is trying to do something on their own, that is one of the things that we try to avoid is that growing pain, but we want the growth. So what are you willing to take in order to achieve that growth? I think that as we look back in the experience that I shared, and as I look back through that ugly, dark time of my life, I wanted to get through it so quickly. I wanted to learn as much as I could. And as a 25-year-old, can I really learn from all of this without having to experience that growing pain in my legs? It's impossible. It really is. Because guess what? If you try to boycott that pain, even if you grow, eventually it's going to bite you in the butt. Eventually it's going to become something that you can't look away from. And that lid is just going to pop open. And if I could do everything all over again, that's exactly what I would do. I would hone in on that pain and that growth and say, what do I actually genuinely need to learn from this experience, grow from it, and evolve? Unfortunately, I think that all of us, and that's the reason why so many people have tried to identify or create time machines, is because we want to change decisions that we made in the past. Because unfortunately, a lot of us, and maybe not a lot of us, but at least in my experience, our growth, our maturity comes at later years. And again, here I am at 40, realizing that I'm still not fully matured. You would have asked me the same question 2 years ago. I would have told you, I'm at the peak. I'm way mature. 5 kids, I have a house, etc. But again, looking back, I wish I would have been more willing to accept the pain that came with growth because I think, and I don't think I know it would have changed the way I grew, period.
Well, there's a mic drop moment for you. Love it. Thank you, brother, for sharing, for being transparent, for being who you are on Tuesday, the same guy on Saturday, same guy that runs an unbelievable marketing firm, Felkrem. For anybody who wants to check in on you, follow your athletes, because there's a lot of them, from best players in the world to all different sports and marketing as well. Where do they find you?
Felkrem.com is our website, and you can learn more about us and our ethos and the way we do business. And the slew of social media handles are there on the website. And then my personal social media handles are all the same across all platforms, Cisco Terreros all together. And come chat. Again, I don't know everything. All I know is I want to connect with rad people who want to continue to grow like I am. And hopefully I could provide some value and vice versa. And I want to take this opportunity to thank you. I look back at my journey and playing collegiate sports, but then dropping out of college, learning everything that I've learned by mistake, by hard work, by being burnt in the kitchen, if you will, wouldn't be possible without a brother and a father figure like yourself who's there saying, maybe take that route, maybe go this way, maybe don't jump here. How many times have you told me, don't jump? And then I was like, what did you just say? I'm already midair, right? And it was like, shit, Brian, help me out. Make sure I don't land on rocks, but rather on a pillow. And again, I think that there's so much value to that that I will be eternally grateful to you. And I know that anybody that listens to this podcast will be able to take that from you, is that well of knowledge and that humility that you put forward. So thank you for that, man.
No,
Appreciate
well,
it.
you're welcome. And I thank you too, because as we teach, we learn. That has never been more evident than what you just talked about today. I've enjoyed the last decade with you and look forward to 4 or 5 more going in the future, God willing. We're going to have in the show notes, you can find all the links to Cisco and his great, amazing company and what they're doing. If you liked our show, what's next? I ask every week, subscribe, let us know what you think. That's how we find more amazing people like Cisco to talk to get in front of, and just to hear pearls of wisdom. I think that's what it's all about, of not what we've done in the past, but what we're doing next. And that's the premise of the show. What's next? So thanks for joining us, and tune in next week.